Good morning. It is Tuesday, June the 11th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. This is Ron, your host. My full name is Ronald T. Hardgrove, and my podcast is about the difference between being a true conservative and being a false conservative or reactionary. It's about what true conservatism is and why it matters. And my podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. That's where you can find it. It's also on iTunes, and it's also on Spotify and various other podcasting. I don't believe it's on iHeart yet, but it is on Spotify and iTunes. So anyways, my email address is storytimes@hotmail.com, and I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hardgrove, and on Facebook at The Drill. Being a true conservative is really about knowing that the essence of any argument is change. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Is conservative. And if it ain't broke, break it, is liberal or socialist. The left is always trying to create movements towards socialist paradise. True conservative is open-minded but unmoved unless there's a good reason to do so. Being truly conservative is also about integrity. Maintaining your integrity is about listening carefully, reading carefully, not getting tricked, about responding and not reacting. Integrity is also about how you live and not just how you vote. True conservatism is not merely a political identity, but a philosophical reality. True conservatism is fundamentally about being realistic, and being realistic is fundamentally about making the presumption for the status quo. So I did want to say also that integrity is important, because without integrity, you have no credibility. And credibility is important because without credibility, you will have no influence. You will have no ability to convince people that you're right and convince people what it is that they should do. So, and again, what does it mean to presume the status quo? It means if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That we recognize the benevolence of the universe and the expectation of success. We make the presumption for the United States of America and all of its institutions, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and trifurcated government. We do not try to turn the United States into another country, either real or imagined. We make the presumption for the evidence of our senses. So that is the introduction to my show. Let's see if I can get rid of that. There we go. So now I want to go on to, from Idris Shah, The Tales of the Dervishes When the Waters Were Changed. Once upon a time, Qadir, the teacher of Moses, called upon mankind with a warning. At a certain date, he said, all the water in the world which had not been specially hoarded would disappear. It would then be renewed with different water, which would drive men mad. Only one man listened to the meaning of this advice. He collected water and went to a secure place where he stored it and waited for the water to change its character. On the appointed date, the stream stopped running, the wells went dry, and the man who had listened, seeing this happening, went to his retreat and drank his preserved water. When he saw from his security, the waterfalls again beginning to flow, this man descended among the other sons of men. He found that they were thinking and talking in an entirely different way from before. Yet they had no memory of what had happened, nor of having been warned. When he tried to talk to them, he realized they thought he was mad, and they showed hostility or compassion, not understanding. At first he drank none of the new water, but went back to his concealment to draw on his supplies every day. Finally, however, he took the decision to drink the new water because he could not bear the loneliness of living, behaving, and thinking in a different way from everyone else. He drank the new water and became like the rest. Then he forgot all about his own store of special water, and his fellows began to look upon him as a madman who had miraculously been restored to sanity. And this is a story that's also told in the terms of a king that has a kingdom, and that there's an evil sorcerer that poisons the well, the kingdom's well, and anyone who drinks from it becomes insane. And so all of the subjects begin drinking from it and become insane, and the king refuses to drink from it. He knows that it's been poisoned, and all of his subjects consider him to be mad, to be insane, and plot to throw him out. And overnight, he slips down unseen to the well, drinks from it. The next day, the whole kingdom rejoices that the king has seen the light. So, part of the reason I picked this is because it was in a movie called Serpico, and it was about a New York City police detective, and he was in amongst corrupt police officers that were on the take and doing all kinds of corrupt things, and he was doing the best he could to remain uncorrupted. He wasn't going to go on the take, he wasn't going to do anything, and his fellow officers saw that as a threat and tried to have him killed, at least on one occasion, but also gave him all kinds of grief about his not willing to be corrupt or corrupted. And Serpico's girlfriend ended up telling him this story about the king and the poisoned well. So, and I feel again that it's particularly appropriate in this day and age with the things that we see going on, particularly in terms of gender issues, where you have people that are just on their own deciding that I'm not any gender. I'm not male, I'm not female, whatever non-gender is. And issues such as this, where we're getting right to the heart of the issue, which is no longer politics, no longer Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, but sanity, reality, whether or not we're going to acknowledge reality. So, when I come back, I am going to be reading from the Ayn Rand lexicon. And thank you very much. And the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon is frozen abstraction, fallacy of. A fallacy, which may be termed, quote, the fallacy of the frozen abstraction, unquote, consists of substituting some one particular concrete for the wider abstract class to which it belongs. In other words, substituting a specific ethics, altruism, for the wider abstraction of ethics. Thus, a man may reject the theory of altruism and assert that he's accepted a rational code. But, failing to integrate his ideas, he continues unthinkingly to approach ethical questions in terms established by altruism. And that is frozen abstraction, the fallacy of, and this concept of the day. I wanted also to clear up, I was thinking yesterday about, I've said that basically being conceptual and abstract is the way of the modern human being, and that telling stories and painting verbal pictures is the way of troglodytes and whatnot. It is, I want to qualify that by saying, it is if you are trying to communicate something intellectual. If your purpose is to entertain, then telling stories or painting verbal pictures is perfectly acceptable. I don't want anyone I don't want it to come off sounding as though this is a rigid situation. Anybody that, including myself, that tells stories or paints verbal pictures is somehow being regressive. Not necessarily. It depends on the context. So again, if you're trying to communicate something intellectual and you're doing it by storytelling and verbal picture painting, then yes, you're being regressive and you're failing to communicate. And there's people I hear on the radio that will call up, say, Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh will ask them a question, and instead of giving Rush Limbaugh a conceptual or abstract answer response, the caller will tell a story. And so it's fascinating. And try it out yourself. Ask various questions from people and listen to the response that you're getting from them. Are you getting a response that is conceptual and abstract? It's concise, it's to the point, or is the person painting verbal pictures and or storytelling? Does it take them a long time to answer your question because they're telling a story? For instance, if you go, did you have a tough day at work today? Yes or no. But they may say, well, I went to work and I talked to my boss, and my boss said to me this, and I said to my boss that, and then my boss got upset, and he said to me blah, blah, blah. So they're telling a story. And they're really not answering your questions in terms of, did you have a good day at work? It's just basically a simple yes or no answer. If it's no, then there might be a follow-up of what happened or why not. And again, you can communicate that conceptually. You don't have to be storytelling. Storytelling then could be used also if you're trying to make a point to somebody they don't understand what it is that you're saying, and if you're using something very, trying to communicate a complex, and you use a story as an example, for instance. But anyways, if you're trying to communicate something intellectual, stick to concepts and abstractions. You're more likely to communicate succinctly and correctly the first time. So, let's see what we got here. Yep, we got that one. The next one is going to be from the Conservative Dictionary when I come back. Thank you very much. And the Conservative Dictionary. And there's several entries in here that I thought were fascinating and never brought to light facts of history I didn't know existed. Nobody talks about. And, you'll figure it out why. I think you can figure out why we don't hear about it very much. The first one is Civil Rights Act of 1875. I read that and I thought, what? 1875? The Civil Rights Act of 1875, signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant, decreed that former slaves be afforded equal and uninhibited access to inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, and that they not be disqualified from jury duty. The law was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883 on the basis that the federal government does not have the power to prohibit discrimination by private individuals. Article 10 of the Bill of Rights. Next entry, Civil Rights Act of 1957. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, signed into law by President Dwight Eisenhower, was essentially a voting rights act which prohibited intimidating, coercing, or otherwise interfering with the rights of persons to vote for president and members of Congress. Democrat Senator Lyndon Johnson, then Senate Majority Leader, had seen to it that the bill had been stripped of most of its teeth before it came out of committee, making the final law little more than a gesture. Real voting rights reform did not occur until passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson, prohibits racial segregation in hotels, restaurants, theaters, and other public use accommodations engaged in interstate commerce. Prohibits state and municipal government from restricting use of public facilities on the basis of race, and prohibits discrimination by federal agencies. Title VII of the law, by far the most controversial section, prohibits racial or gender discrimination by private employers with 15 or more employees. Article 10 of the Bill of Rights clearly prohibits the federal government's telling a Texas company who it may and may not hire. Supreme Court nonetheless ignored the decision of 1883 and upheld Title VII on the diaphanous basis of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the right to, quote, regulate interstate commerce, unquote. So anyways, I thought those were interesting because, for obvious reasons, Civil Rights Act of 1875 and 1957, never heard of them. Nobody ever teaches it in school. Nobody ever teaches it in school. Or will you ever hear a Democrat or anybody on the Democrat-controlled news networks talk about Civil Rights Act of 1875 or the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and they will especially not talk about what happened to those Civil Rights Acts. So, good stuff. And the next one that I'm going to be reading from is going to be the reactionary... No, I'm going to go ahead and I have a new one, and it's called If You Can Keep It. I was originally doing Op Hawkeye, and because I wanted to memorialize fallen soldiers, specific fallen soldiers, but because of technical difficulties, it's difficult to do. And so I decided then what I would do is find a book that memorialized soldiers in general. That's why I got Soldier Dead. Unfortunately, it turns out that it's much more technically oriented than what I want. I was looking for more of like what I saw in the introduction, which was stories about those individuals that had been killed in action that I thought would be very poignant. But again, it turns out that it's going to be more of a, technical, about how and why the government does what it does, the size of coffins or whatever. And that's not what I'm looking for there. So I did find something else, though. It's called If You Can Keep It, and it's a book of basically patriotic, with a patriotic theme. So I'll be reading from that when I come back. And thank you very much. Eric Metaxas is the author of the book that is called If You Can Keep It. And this is the introduction, The Promise. Nothing is more wonderful than the art of being free, but nothing is harder to learn how to use than freedom. It's a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America.
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding right now. Please.
In the heart of Philadelphia, in a Georgian brick building that still stands, one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the world took place. There, in what is today called Independence Hall, over the course of about 100 days in the summer of 1787, some of the most brilliant men of that or any other era created what would become the Constitution of a new country. They were creating the legal foundation for a form of government that had never been tried before, and they were creating the possibility and the golden and glorious promise of something called the United States of America. The men in that room were an astounding array of the leading lights of American history. George Washington was there, along with Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Roger Sherman, among others. No one could reasonably debate whether the 4,200-word document that they ended up with is one of the greatest documents in the history of the world. If its emergence there was not quite as unprecedented as Athena's parthenogenic birth from the brow of Zeus, it is close enough to warrant comparison and amazement. The Constitution was a ship of state that the founders launched onto history's ocean that summer, the likes of which had never been seen. The world goggled at it. They also wondered what would become of this great and strange bark. Would it sail long or soon sink? No one could know. And if it was to succeed and last, precisely how would it do that? How could it, being so very fragile? Why should it float for long? And yet it did. Whatever it was that they created that summer in that building has so grown and flourished in the more than 2 centuries following that it is simply without equal. But who could know in 1787 what would spring from the nation made possible by that document created in those 100 days? No one but God. Today we know that in historical terms, the nation there formed has since soared across the heavens like no other. But in 1787, it still only pointed toward the future, like an arrow in a cocked bow. The potential power in that bow was incalculable, but the promise of the arrow's flight had intrigued much of the world. It held great promise in many ways because it was itself a promise to every American, present and future, and to everyone in the world beyond America too. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. said that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence before it constituted a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It was a promise that was not fulfilled instantly, and that was not fulfilled in King's day, and that is not yet fulfilled in ours, at least not in full. It is a promise that is being fulfilled and that must keep on being fulfilled. And we are the ones who must fulfill it, who must keep that promise. But what is required of us to keep that promise and to continue to fulfill it? What is required of us, of each one of us who are, quote, we the people, is something we have mostly forgotten. That is the reason I'm writing this book. Benjamin Franklin sums all of this up in the title of this book, as I shall explain in a moment. But the main point is that each of us who call ourselves Americans has a great duty to keep that promise. And if we don't do our duty toward keeping that promise, our nation will soon cease to exist in any real sense. If that sounds overly dramatic, please keep reading. It is not enough for us merely to exist as people, doing the minimum of simply obeying our laws and minding our own business. Much more is required of Americans if America is truly to be America. In Dickens' A Christmas Carol, when Marley's ghost confronts Scrooge, Scrooge wonders at Marley's chains. What has his old business partner done to deserve such punishment? Quote, "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," unquote, Scrooge says, to which Marley gives a forceful response. Quote, "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business," unquote. Marley's bracing words might well suffice to sum up our situation as a nation. We cannot pretend that it's sufficient for us to mind our own business. The founders understood that the republic that came into being in 1787 could not continue long if every American did not make the business of that republic his or her business. They understood that America would not flourish without great help from all Americans. That was the only way it would work and the only way it could work. The government had given us something precise or precious and fragile, a newborn babe for whom all of us were obliged to care. The ordered liberties and how they were to work together required a citizenry devoted to keeping them in order. So we were all in it together, else it would not work. So the promise of America in 1787 was a promise to all future Americans, as Dr. King reminds us. As far into the future as we're willing to keep that promise, the possibility of our continuing to keep that promise would vanish if we failed to take our duties seriously. Future Americans depend on present-day Americans doing their duty in this. And there's even more to it than that, because in the end, the promise of this nation was also a promise to the whole world beyond this nation, as we shall see. The Constitution given to us that 1787 was a sufficient beginning. It was the foundation of the United States of America. But merely existing and merely obeying the laws that stem from that Constitution was hardly what the founders had in mind. The idea that our government is we the people is not a corny idea that doesn't mean much. It is something that is utterly real. It is, in fact, an idea of great genius and is the main operating principle by which this nation has stayed alive and has expanded its freedoms for over 2 centuries. But once we, the people, began to forget that and cease to do what is necessary as Americans, it all begins to fall apart. And alas and alack, we have gone a long way toward forgetting that and toward ceasing to do what is necessary as Americans. We are in desperate, indeed urgent, need of a primer on these vital things. On a lighter note, it may help to remember that in the movie Annie Hall, Woody Allen says to Diane Keaton that a relationship is like a shark, and that in order to stay alive, it must be keep moving forward. Quote, I think what we got on our hands, he says to her, quote, is a dead shark, unquote. So lest we become something similar with infinitely greater consequences, we need to keep swimming. We can never say, quote, we have fulfilled the promise, unquote. It is an endless project, but continuing to fulfill that promise is at the very heart of what it means to be the United States of America. It is who we are. To cease doing what is necessary along these lines is to cease existing. But we are today in very real danger of doing just that, of becoming America in name only. I believe our situation in present-day America is grave, but this book is not meant to be discouraging. In fact, by way of encouragement, before we consider what we have forgotten and what we must do, let's first acknowledge that despite our difficulties and considerable failings, much of America's promise has already been fulfilled, and spectacularly so. For beyond what anyone might have imagined, for example, let's remember the country created in that room in Philadelphia soon swelled westward to the mighty Mississippi and then crossed that divide to balloon farther westward to fill the entire continent, from one blue ocean to the other. Let's remember that 8 decades after that summer, the country would be in the bloodletting of a terrible civil war, legally cancel a shameful, would in the bloodletting of a terrible civil war legally cancel a shameful original sin of slavery. Let's remember that it would afterward create inventions unimaginable to previous generations, outracing sound via the telegraph and flooding silences with the music of the phonograph, and harnessing electricity to illuminate the darkness with delicate glass bulbs. And it would invent the motion picture so that people in darkened theaters could dream while still awake, and it would loft human beings into the world of the birds above our heads in winged apparatuses that would eventually soar across continents and then across oceans. And it would, via assembly line innovation, make the horseless carriage available to the working man. And it would invent baseball and football and basketball. And it would, in 2 years, defend civilization and democracy from totalitarian tyranny. And it would invent jazz and blues and rock and roll. And it would invent a device that could make what was happening in one place appear instantly to other people thousands of miles away. And it would make this device available to almost everyone. And it would vault our species beyond Earth's gravity and onto other heavenly bodies, depositing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 men onto the white surface of the moon. And it would invent the computer. And it would invent the internet with its endless information going to and fro over the surface of the earth. All of these things and so many more were made possible by that one document written in that hot room in Philadelphia over the course of 100 days. That promise to the future of the world. But we must again remind ourselves that the Constitution guaranteed none of these future things any more than the Big Bang or the cooling of the earth guaranteed the Constitution. It was only a beginning that made them possible, just as it still makes so much more possible. The promise of that document has been kept to the extent that so much has been done thus far. But as I have said, it promises much more still to be kept, which must be kept now and tomorrow by you and by me. And this vital idea that everything promised by the Constitution depended on the people of the newly formed country was not lost on those in that room in Philadelphia, as the following story makes clear. So I will save for tomorrow, and I'll be back in a minute. Okay, thank you very much. And the Way to Go Donald Trump section of, or part of the podcast is here. So I'm going to read some of his President Trump's tweets. Why did the Democrats run if they didn't want to do things? And that's sent to @Senator Rick Scott. Good day in the stock market. People have no idea the tremendous potential our country has for growth and many other things. If Mexico produces, which I think they will, biggest part of the deal with Mexico has not yet been revealed. China is similar, except they devalue currency and subsidize companies to less than effective 25% tariff. So far, little effect to consumer. Companies will relocate to the U.S. Companies to come to the USA and to get companies that have left us for other lands to come back home. We stupidly lost 30% of our auto business to Mexico. If the tariffs went on at higher level, they would all come back and pass. But very happy with the deal I made. And let me see if there's anything else I want to read here. See, Maria, Dagan, Steve, Stuart V. When you are the big piggy bank that other countries have been ripping off for years to a level that is not to be believed, tariffs are a great negotiating tool, a great revenue producer, and most importantly, a powerful way to get things done. So again, I say this is the way to go President Trump section because, and I read from his tweets, because he communicates like a regular person. He does not waste a lot of time speaking out of both sides of his mouth, trying to make everybody happy. He says what he knows to be the truth and lets the chips fall where they may. And good for him. Back in a minute. Thank you very much. And so, who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is a lifestyle. They are patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments instead of predictions, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They are consistent, credible, and influential. Not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. In other words, they are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.